This is the Jamf admin updates from WWDC 2023. Okay, we've got a lot of highlights from this year. We have improvements to software updates. We have automated device enrollment improvements, Passkeys and managed Apple IDs, platform single sign-on had a lot of cool upgrades. You can now manage Apple Watches. We have some enhancements to Apple Configurator. And we also are going to go over network relays, a cool new feature. So a lot to go over. We'll try to go through it pretty quick. One thing to get started, one disclaimer, that is at the end of every video in WWDC. The information and technologies described within are subject to change. So as we're going through a lot of these cool new things that they're presenting on, first off, a lot of the stuff that they're presenting on is really for different providers, MDMs, or identity providers like Okta to integrate into their product, and not necessarily stuff for us like Jamf admins to be able to use. So we need to see how these are going to be implemented into those products. And then, as the statement says here, sometimes they backtrack or don't really release stuff on the timeline that they say they're going to. So something to bear in mind as we go through this. We'll try to take all of this with a grain of salt. But the first exciting feature we want to go over is these software update improvements. And just for anyone who isn't aware, software updates is what the terminology Apple uses for macOS updates specifically. And before we get into what the improvements are, I want to go over a little bit of the history of software update improvements in WWDCs. So back in 2020, Apple introduced a new way to update macOS with an MDM command, which seemed really awesome. They did fail to mention that they were slowly deprecating the software update command that we'd always been using. So that really threw a wrench in the system of how we'd been updating macOS. Now the way we did it through Jamf no longer worked through a policy, and the way we scripted it also didn't work. And instead we had to use this MDM command, and it did not work quite as advertised. In 2021, though, they announced deferrals for the MDM command. So that gave the user a way to be able to defer the update instead of it just pushing and restarting their computer without notifying them at all. We were really excited about that, but once that OS dropped and we got to experiment with it, we realized that that in order for the update to install, it must be acknowledged by the user. And sometimes that acknowledgement window wouldn't even show up if they were using certain monitors. And then once they did acknowledge it and it deployed, the Mac randomly restarted as soon as the app update was done installing. So it wasn't great. And then last year, they announced a bunch of improvements for the MDM command. Listed here, the priority key for schedule OS update, more logging and auditing, and then also these rapid security responses, which were promising, hey, we're going to deploy macOS updates without having to restart the computer. So that was really exciting. But that was last year, and what does everyone think that how software updates went in the last year? They were kind of a disaster. So it seems like Apple keeps improving things, and they keep getting worse. So let's see how things are this year. So this is what they talked about. There's kind of a new window that comes up that allows them to install or try later. And then they're going to keep sending these notifications at a more frequent basis until they finally send them off. So that seems pretty cool. There's also this new window that says an update is past due and it will be installed automatically in the next hour. Besides that, we didn't get much information on what actually will be happening. But they did talk about these new software update statuses as well. From what I understand, these are statuses for MDM providers. So if we're trying to script a software update workflow, we can't utilize these these types of statuses into our workflow, which would be really great because it would be awesome to be able to notify the user whether the software update is downloading or installing with like a dep notify window. Possibly this is on a plist somewhere that I don't know of, and once we get our hands on the beta, we'll be able to fool around with that and see, but from my understanding, this is just something that'll show up in the MDM status. So with all this, I'm not super holding my breath. I hope this will improve everything, but every year they've been making improvements. It's actually been getting worse, and I haven't seen any videos that actually address some of the problems we've had in the past. So more news later once we're actually able to test some of this stuff. There are some exciting improvements though to automated and device enrollment, and the first one I really like, which is requiring a minimum macOS version during the setup assistant. So what's going to happen is as the user is going through the setup assistant for the first time, they click continue on the automated device enrollment screen. From what they were saying, the computer would restart, install the newest OS version that is required, and then it would continue to go through the setup assistant. So that's a good way to get people into compliance right away through the setup assistant. However, I can also see that being a little bit of a wonky workflow for someone setting up their device for the first time, because they're going to go through the setup assistant and then have to wait 30 minutes for an OS update to happen. Before then, they have to then go through the rest of the setup assistant and set up their Mac. But cool feature regardless. Another thing is requiring file vault, which I'm not essentially sure how this is going to work because we're already able to require file vault with an MDM, and we're able to do it at the first login. So once the account is created and the user logs in, it forces them to enable file vault. So I guess this will happen a little bit earlier in the setup assistant. I guess kind of cool. It'll be fun to check it out. And then the last one, I don't know if I really like. I guess I'm not sure what it is because they didn't give much information on it. But they're saying enforcing automated device enrollment, which automated device enrollment is already enforced. If you set it up, unless the user does not connect to Wi-Fi, it forces them to go through it. But the window they showed when they were demonstrating this, they showed this Not Now button in the lower left, which makes me think that they're actually taking away the enforcement for it and allowing users to just not set up their devices right away. We'll see how that actually works. Hopefully we can remove that button. But if they do click Not Now, it will require them, they said, within 8 hours to enroll in the MDM. Not sure how that's going to work. Not sure how they require them to do that, or if there's any way for them to get around that. But we'll see once we're able to do some more testing. Next up, we're going to talk about Passkeys and managed Apple IDs. These are some pretty exciting updates that I want to go through. First of all, what are passkeys? So passkeys are essentially the underlying architecture behind Touch ID and Face ID. So if you're confused what we're talking about with passkeys, just think on a Mac, Touch ID, and on an iPhone, Face ID. Some of the new features that we have for passkeys is the ability to force Touch ID and Face ID, the ability to control the iCloud keychain, using Touch ID and Face ID to log into corporate products. This will require applications to actually add it to their products, or if you have an internal application, you could code that into your product so they could log into those internal applications using Touch ID and Face ID, much like applications do. Define which users can log in using a managed Apple ID. And one of the requirements for all these new features with Passkeys is having a managed Apple ID. So I think we'll start to see this being adopted more in the enterprise as Apple's trying to go this direction of getting everyone in a corporate environment to have a managed Apple ID. So let's talk about managed Apple IDs. So first of all, a managed Apple ID can now do a lot more than it used to be. They were very limited, especially on the business side, and Apple's slowly adding more features to what it can do. One of the most notable things that's not here, though, is the ability to download apps from the App Store, which I think is one of the most useful features of an Apple ID. We have a lot of clients that users just want to be able to download apps, and they can't do that. They have to set up a personal Apple ID. But this next feature is pretty cool. It's the ability to log in with a personal and a managed Apple ID to the same device. So that will be pretty interesting. They didn't have a screenshot of this for macOS, and they didn't really explain if it was available for macOS as well. But we can see that it's available to iPhone, and hopefully it will also be available for macOS. So if you need to install apps and you can't do it with your managed Apple ID, you can still log in with your personal Apple ID as well, at least in theory. We can also restrict sign-in via MDM. And this works both for allowing users to sign in with a managed Apple ID to either a managed device or a supervised device, so that once you give them this managed Apple ID, they can't log into a bunch of personal devices with it. They can only log in to a device managed with your MDM. And you can also do the same for iCloud. So iCloud's becoming more useful as an enterprise tool to be able to manage user data, much like OneDrive or something else. So that's a cool feature. And then with everything kind of being tied to managed Apple IDs, it's really important for Apple to be able to offer federated authentication support. Basically, this means that you can associate a identity provider that you have, like Azure AD or Google Workspace, to Apple Business Manager or Apple School Manager, so that you can automatically create all of those managed Apple IDs and have them match the same username and password as is in those other identity providers. So they've already had this support for Azure AD and Google Workspace, but now they're adding the support for Okta, they said, by the end of the year. And really the cool thing is they're adding the support for any custom identity provider. So from my understanding, you'd be able to add any identity provider that's using OpenID and SCIM for directory sync, but it may be something where the identity provider may have to do some work in the back end to offer that support. But I think we're going to see a lot more identity providers being added through this. Now, one of the things they teased that they also teased back in 2021 was BYOD for macOS, or user enrollment for macOS. When they first introduced this feature back in 2021, they had this giant thing about iOS, and then right at the end, they were like, and this will be available for macOS as well, with no information about it, no demos or anything, and it still is not available 2 years later. And they made it sound like it was going to be available this year as well, but again, I didn't see any videos on it, any demonstration, not a single screenshot, so I'm not holding my breath for it, but hopefully it's something we're going to see soon. Next up, Platform Single Sign-On had some really cool upgrades. And yes, put in the chat if anyone's using this right now. I'd like to see their experience. But one of the things they're adding, one of the big things, is creating a local user account through Platform SSO. So you'll be able to log in with your identity provider and create a local user account. Another cool upgrade is the ability to access it from system settings. So you can actually do some different things like repair your registration or authenticate with your token. And then there's some cool configuration settings that they talked about as well. One is administrator groups. And this would be able to define which users will be administrators once they go through to create the login initially. Authorization groups, which defines what standard users can access without elevated permissions. So in the example, they allowed users to be able to change printer settings without needing elevated access. And then they also have additional groups, which creates a local group that if it doesn't exist, makes it available in the local directory service. Their example for this was the sudo command, but they didn't explain very much how that worked or what the use case for that would be. But the ability to do administration groups and authorization groups really enhances what Platform SSO has been doing. So this starts to bring up the question, as they're improving Platform SSO and putting more features into it, is this a replacement for Jamf Connect? I think at this point it's a little bit early to say, but what I will say is although they did have some good screenshots of Platform SSO, they didn't have any video demonstrations of how it worked. And when I don't see a video demonstration and I don't get a ton of information on how this actually works, I'm a little skeptical of whether or not it will be a full-fledged solution to work on its own. So we'll see more in the future once we're able to test this out, but I think we might need at least another year before this will actually replace something as robust as Jamf Connect. But one of the most exciting things that was announced is the ability to manage Apple Watches. Yes, this has finally come after the 10th iOS of Apple Watch coming out. We now have the ability to be able to manage Apple Watches. So what can we do? Well, first off, how do we enroll them? Well, the Apple Watch must be paired to a managed iPhone, which is fine. I don't know anyone who has an Apple Watch that doesn't also have an iPhone. I think you need to have an iPhone to set it up. One of the caveats, though, is the user is prompted to enroll, and we can't enforce them to enroll. So the user needs to choose to enroll on their own accord. I'm guessing in the future they'll add the ability to force that, but for now, the user has the choice to not enroll their Apple Watch. So what can we actually do with Apple Watches? Surprisingly, quite a lot. I was expecting it to be pretty limited, kind of like Apple TVs when they first announced management. But we're able to do a lot, like network configurations. So you can do Wi-Fi, cellular, and per app VPN. Security configurations, SCEP and ACME payloads, password policy payloads, and restrictions payload, although it didn't go into much detail on what we can do with restrictions, but that's something we can do. We can also do remote commands, like clearing a passcode, locking the Apple Watch, erasing it, and then unrolling it from MDM. And then lastly, and most excitingly, we can actually deploy apps to Apple Watches. And I'm going to explain how this works. So there's 3 different types of apps you can deploy. You can deploy a paired app, and this is an app that is paired to an app on the iPhone. A dependent app, which is basically the same thing. It's also paired, except it is dependent. You cannot install it separately from the iPhone. And then there is a standalone app, and those are apps that can actually be deployed independently of the iPhone. So with both paired and dependent apps, it deploys to the iPhone first, and then you can send a command to deploy it to the Apple Watch. And with standalone apps, you just send a command to deploy it to the Apple Watch. So super exciting that they finally gave us a way to manage Apple Watches in the enterprise. Next thing that's kind of exciting is Apple Configurator enhancements. So the coolest thing here is automatically being able to assign devices to an MDM when you're retroactively adding them through Apple Configurator to automated enrollment. So in the past, what we had to do is you'd retroactively add it with Apple Configurator, and then you'd have to sign into your Apple Business Manager account, and then you'd have to assign it to your MDM. That's fine if you're just doing a couple at a time, but if you're trying to do massive amounts of thousands of iPads or iPhones, this can be a real big pain to have to go back and forward. Typically, you'd batch it where you do a bunch of them and then move them all over, and then do another bunch of them and move them all over. But now you can do this all at once, where you set up, you prepare the device, and you assign it to the MDM, and it starts downloading all the apps it needs. So that's really exciting, along with this next feature, which really allows you to do a lot of automation with Apple Configurator. They have given support for the Shortcuts app. And they had a really cool screenshot here showing you what you can do. And if you look closely at this, you can do a lot of fun things. Like if you plug in the device, it will erase all contents and settings. It'll prepare it. And then it will even start running bash scripts. And in this example, it runs a bash script to pull a CSV of all these asset tags, and then runs an MDM command, or a API command, to be able to add that asset tag to your MDM. So very exciting, lots of cool automation here for people setting up massive amounts of iPads. I think with this, we'll be able to see like a lot of creativity in types of stuff that we can set up with iPads for the first time. So cool to check out this feature and see how it works in the future. Another exciting thing that they talked about in WWDC is network relays. So what are network relays? Network relays are basically the same architecture that they've utilized for Private Relay, which they released last year. And Private Relay is, if you've been using a newer OS on the Mac, you've probably seen that when you connect to Wi-Fi networks, it turns on Private Relay, which basically acts as like a VPN on your computer, protecting the traffic on your computer from wherever you're connecting through your Wi-Fi. This can be great even on your own home Wi-Fi, so your ISP can't see what you're connecting to, but especially if you're going to a coffee shop or a hotel or traveling anywhere else where you maybe don't trust the ISP as much. But now they've added this same functionality for the corporate environment. So as they're claiming, this is a replacement for corporate VPNs. Now, I'm not a security expert or a network expert, so I can't really say much on that, but it'll be interested to see if this is adopted over the traditional VPN method. It can also be deployed via configuration profiles. It can be developed straight into applications. So as they were saying, you could have certain parts of your app utilize network relays and go into an internal part of the network, and then other parts of the app not, or maybe the entire app go into your internal network. So really cool stuff there. And then it's also going to be available for tvOS. So that's exciting as well. Another cool feature is Easy Student Sign-In. Quick demonstration here. If you bring the student iPad, close to the teacher iPad and scan the code that comes up, the teacher will actually be able to log in for the student to the iPad. Caveat here is the teacher iPad has to be managed and logged in with a managed Apple ID, and they both need to be in the same MDM. But after that, they can select the class, they can even look up the student and log the student in themselves. If you're a K through 12 school, especially like a K through 3 school, that will be a really exciting way to get users logged in to their iPads. And along with that, there's a lot of other updates they discussed. There's some cool updates to declarative device management, certificate improvements, password policy improvements, return to service, which automatically wipes an iPad and restores it by deploying a Wi-Fi profile during that process. So not only do they have the improvements to like the shortcuts for Apple Configurator, but if we just want to send a wipe command and reconfigure a device, the user can do that, or we can do that as an MDM without the user having to even reset up the device at all, which is really cool. There's also some shared iPad enhancements, and then private cellular networks, which they talked about as well.